Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be using my Super-i-ometer, which is a special machine that I have created that can work out what the best is of two things. It's a very special machine, top secret, but I'm going to use the Super-i-ometer to work out who is the greatest band between Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, right? So there's been a lot of people on my channel saying that I should, well, say a lot, probably one, but saying I should put Led Zeppelin up against Deep Purple, but that seems an obvious thing to do, and I know who's going to win. It's going to be Led Zeppelin, so I'm not going to do that. But what we have here are perhaps the two biggest bands of all time, the Beatles being the biggest band of the 1960s, and Led Zeppelin being the biggest band of the 1970s. These are two monumental bands, and I think they both represent different things, so it'd be interesting to try and pit these against each other. So first of all, I need to calibrate the Super-i-ometer. Now, I don't normally do this on camera, but people have asked me about it. So basically the way I calibrate it is by putting in a band which is sort of between the two, and then putting in another band or artist which is completely unlike either, so that the Super-i-ometer can get an idea what they're dealing with. So the albums I'm going to calibrate it with is the album that I think is somewhere between Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, would be ELO. So we're going to put Discovery, and I think that's the right one to put in. So I'll just take this one out. There we go. There we go. So I'm just going to feed this in. Hang on. Right, and the other album I thought I would use, is quite obvious choice really, is Shirley Bassey, with the Nelson Riddle Orchestra. There she is. Who doesn't like Shirley Bassey? So we'll just feed that one in as well. Look at that. Lovely vinyl record. So I'm just going to feed this one in. Oh, come on, in you go. Right, so let's fire it up. Oh, this is always a stressful moment. So yes, going, analysing. Yes, so Beatles versus Led Zeppelin. There we go. Right, so they are in. So we could start the analysis. So the Super-i-ometer analyses each group on 10 different attributes. It gives the point to either one. It's either you get the point or you don't, and then the Super-i-ometer at the end will top those up, and we should have a definitive factual fact about who is the greatest of these two artists. We love factual facts here. They're the sort of facts we like, so that's what we're going for. So the first one is innovation. Now, these are two massively innovative bands. These are two bands that did all sorts of things first, right? Now, if we take Led Zeppelin are one of the first sort of blues rock crossover groups to really achieve incredible success. So in the late 60s we have bands like Cream and Hendrix coming out and basically fusing blues with pop music, I suppose, which forms this thing that we are now call rock music. And Led Zeppelin are the band that really defined that in the late 60s, and that is the basis for hard rock, heavy metal, thrash metal, all sorts of things I think are really personified by Led Zeppelin at that point. Once they get going, by Led Zeppelin 3, I think it could be argued that actually the first two albums are brilliant but are derivative. So derivative that there's actual versions of blues songs and actual versions of other artists' songs, you know, that they basically just taken wholesale and dropped into those albums. By 1970, when they do Led Zeppelin 3, I feel that's the point where Led Zeppelin become highly innovative and they start to pull in sort of English folk music, Americana, a whole bunch of different genres of music, and also they bring in enhanced studio techniques. Jimmy Page is a brilliant producer who uses the studio in a different way. He stops close miking and he brings in the ambience of the rooms. does all sorts of tricks with the recording process. Led Zeppelin are known as an incredible live band, but when you listen to the albums, you actually listen to albums that have multiple overdubs and a lot of studio trickery, and there's some tracks by Led Zeppelin that can't really be played live because of the amount of studio trickery. Now, where did they get that from? Well, of course they got it from the Beatles, and for me to go back and say what the Beatles innovated is a ridiculous thing to do, right? The Beatles are probably they're probably one of the most innovative bands, artist groups of all time. You know, I'm not going to go into it. It's obvious that the point here is going to go to the Beatles. That's undeniable. So we have a point to the Beatles here. So straight off, the Beatles are in the lead, right? So the next parameter that the super-i-ometer measures is technical ability. Now, the Beatles were a pretty tight Liverpudlian R&B band to start off with. The innovations that they came to later on really came through working with George Martin and being able to use his production and arrangement skills to and the recording studio to really create something which was beyond what we would expect from popular music, especially the 1960s. Are they great virtuosos? Well, I don't think they are. And this is a contentious argument, but I really believe that the sort of technically the most advanced musician in the Beatles was Ringo Starr. I think that when they went to the studio originally with Pete Best, the other three guys were okay. George Martin could let them go, but a band always needs a drummer that's solid, consistent, and all those types of things, and Pete Best wasn't that. If you go back and listen to the recordings that they did with Pete Best, you can hear that. So they had to go and get a guy who could play, and they went and got Ringo Starr. Now, I'm not saying Ringo Starr's Tony Williams, but Ringo Starr comes in with a very solid, metronomic, a beautiful feel, incredible backbeat, and he's really innovative as well as a drummer, really laying the groundwork for the sort of straight eighth note rock beat, which is the bedrock of rock music. You know, before then, a lot of the drummers that were coming out and making waves, people like Earl Palmer and all those drummers, they have a swinging pulse that comes from rhythm and blues and jazz. Ringo hasn't got that. Ringo's got this sort of straight down the line, and of course, Ringo Starr was a very big influence on John Bonham. Now, you're going to say, how do you know that, Andy? Because there's nothing out there that says that. Well, of course, I used to play for Robert Plant for a certain amount of time, and my best friend Kevin Gammond was in the band with John Bonham in the Band of Joy alongside Robert. And I once asked Kev, I said, who do you think the big influence was on Bonham? And he says, well, I think it was probably the biggest one was Ringo Starr. And so I'm not saying it's the biggest one, but it's definitely an influence. So we can see that Ringo is a very important musician. The fact that he decides to go through a very minimalist song-orientated approach is part of his musical genius. I would rate his virtuosity on that. Now, people are shouting at me that there were better drummers in the band, that Paul McCartney could play drums better than Ringo Starr. I don't think that's the case. And us drummers that know and can analyse what Ringo was doing can see that he was actually a very, very good drummer and could do some pretty tricky stuff. The rest of the guys, they're okay. Now, when we go to Led Zeppelin, what we have here is a completely different band. The Beatles were formed in Liverpool. They were mates. Even when they grabbed Ringo from Rory Storm's group, these are all Liverpool guys. This is a local set of people. With Led Zeppelin, what we have with John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page is the cream of the London session scene at that point. Though these guys have worked as session musicians, as arrangers, they are virtuoso musicians. When they discover Robert Plant, Robert at that time is one of the best singers in the UK at that time. They originally wanted Terry Reid. Terry Reid didn't want to do it. I think he just signed a deal. And he'd seen Robert. And Robert already, remember by this time, was already in London. He'd already had a deal. He'd been in that group Listen. He'd had some solo records out. He'd worked with Alexis Corner. He was known as being an incredible singer. But here in Birmingham, there was a phenomenon. And that was John Bonham. And everybody knew about John Bonham around here. And so and it's almost like the magical piece of the jigsaw for Zeppelin is that when Robert's brought in, he said, well, you want to try my drummer out, John Bonham. John Bonham was a very capable drummer, you know, which is an understatement. So obviously technical ability is going to go to Led Zeppelin. So we're even at the moment, we're even. And we're now going to move on to charisma. Now this is a really difficult one. And me personally, I would probably put it 50-50, but the Super-i-ometer has come up with the Beatles as winning this point. Now, I think this is because for all the incredible rock god personification that Led Zeppelin have, especially Robert Plant and Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page is almost like the archetypal guitar hero with the Les Paul Strongs down low and the dragon trousers, you know, and the sort of wizardy manipulation of his theremin. And of course, the golden god look of Robert Plant there with his bare chest and his how can we describe it, his trousers that are very descriptive of their contents, and you know, the sort of blonde hair. And I can remember Robert telling me that they used to set up a yellow light at the back of the stage and spot it, so when Robert walked to the front of the stage, his hair would light up like a golden halo. It's all very religious, it's all very messianic. And so Led Zeppelin really stand there as being one of the most charismatic bands in music history. If I was making a encyclopedia of rock, I could put Robert Plant on the front to personify rock. I could put Jimi Hendrix on the front. Now, could I put the Beatles? Well, you could. And I think the Beatles, they really, in the early days, created a new trend for popular music, which is so important. Before then, pop stars had been sort of musical versions of film stars. If you think of Elvis Presley, or in this country Billy Fury, good-looking guys or good-looking women, or they came from that sort of black rhythm and blues sort of review, you know, where they could stand on stage like a Tina Turner or a James Brown and just blow everybody away. And you think of what Tina Turner looks like, or you think of what James Brown looks like. And actually Led Zeppelin, when you look at Robert Plant, is actually a throwback to that. The Beatles weren't that. The Beatles weren't superstars. They weren't godlike. The Beatles were regular working class chaps, lads, right? They had a brilliant sense of humour. They had a ribaldry and camaraderie that was evident. And I think in the early days, this was one of the most important things for shifting popular music away from that sort of untouchable superstar to suddenly somebody that we can identify with, right? They weren't particularly good-looking guys, but they really invent that sort of music fan thing where they were worshipped, you know, these screaming fans. The Beatles define this for me. And from then on, when you look at someone like Elvis Costello or Robert Smith or Morrissey or any of these people that don't conform to the norm of the sort of film star, pop star, that's straight back to the Beatles. And all four of them had really strong personalities, right? So I think the Super-i-ometer is right there to make that point. So now we have 1 point going to the Beatles. The next one is composition. Now, Led Zeppelin have written some incredible songs. You know, I think if I was doing a top 10 songs of all time, we could stick Stairway to Heaven on. And when I was a kid, that was always quoted as being the greatest song ever. So they were pretty nifty writing songs. The thing about Led Zeppelin, and this would be the difference between a band like Queen and Led Zeppelin. Queen are a sort of Led Zeppelin styled band, but they have vocal hooks. And what I mean by vocal hooks in this case is stuff that someone can sing along with down the pub. You know, you can go over, you know, to a jukebox at a pub and you can put a Queen song, We Are the Champions. And before you know it, the whole pub could be singing along, or bar, if you're not in the UK. The whole bar will be singing along going, we are the champions, my friends. They'll all be doing that, you know. Or they could be singing that na 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 na. They could be doing all that. The Beatles, right? Yesterday is one of the greatest songs I've ever written. So this is where, as we see, this is not to denigrate the greatness of Zeppelin, but the Beatles just have those vocal melodies and hooks, but they also have the incredible groundbreaking arrangements. And when something like Zeppelin is flying off doing Stairway to Heaven or No Quarter, the fact that they could do that, that sort of progressive aspect that's in their music, comes from the Beatles. It comes from Sgt. Pepper. So it's a really hard one to go up against the Beatles. You know, and I haven't spoken that much about the Beatles on this channel. And I was originally going to go into my record collection, my vinyl collection, and pull out an album by the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, and I realised that I haven't got any Beatles albums on vinyl. I've got a few on CD, but not on vinyl, and that is because I, as a younger man, was never that interested in the Beatles, right? So my adulation and admiration for this group has really come from me learning more about music, music composition, music production, the music industry, and I have really come to realise the greatness of this band and how multifaceted their greatness is. So, composition again, we're getting a point going to the Beatles, right? Do I have to prove this? You know, how many incredible songs have the Beatles written? Now, with Zeppelin songs, a lot of them rely on sort of blues-based riffs, instrumental virtuosity, and a lot of the time, what we're appreciating melodically is Robert Plant going, it's all that blues shouting thing. Now, Lennon could do this. Paul McCartney could do that. They'd grown up listening to Chuck Berry. They could do that. I think Twist and Shout, they can do that as well. And Twist and Shout is the example that then moves on to Black Dog or A Whole Lot of Love in terms of vocal style. So this is where the Beatles just seem to be so, you know, all-encompassing. So you get another point here going to the Beatles. Right, so the next parameter is production. Now, I've spoken a little bit about this before. Both bands were incredible in terms of their production. The Beatles are groundbreaking in terms of their production. But as I said before, Jimmy Page and what he'd learned throughout the 60s working within different recording studios, and also John Paul Jones' incredible arrangement skills, and you put those two things together, and Led Zeppelin are leading the way. You know, and me as a music producer, I have taken so much from Zeppelin in terms of how you record instruments, how you use room sound, how you get a big drum sound, how you get a big guitar sound, the capturing of improvisation in the recording studio, and how improvisation works production-wise, you know. Some Led Zeppelin songs are hyper-arranged. If you think of something like the Rain song or Song Remains the Same. But if you listen to something like In My Time of Dying, it almost sounds like just a brilliant band in a room. It just sounds like a brilliant band in the room playing. And whereas to the Beatles, well, you get that as well. Beatles on that first album, they'd record that all in a 12-hour session or something one day. And by the time you get to Sgt. Pepper or, you know, Magical Mystery Tour, they are pushing the studio to its limits. So both bands are incredible for this. And so they both get a half a point each here for production, right? So next parameter on here is influence. Again, we're talking about two of the biggest influential bands of all time. I think in terms of popular music, in terms of influencing things like progressive rock and everything that comes in afterwards, in terms of influencing Zeppelin, the Beatles have this huge influence. But instrumentally, how many musicians out there are influenced by Zeppelin? Now, me as a drummer, I would love to know the percentage of my drum DNA that comes from John Bonham. John Bonham has a way and a feel of playing that I try and access all the time. The other thing with John Bonham is the way he arranges his drum parts, things like not crashing on the beginning of the bar, you know, the use of sort of displacement to move the beat around, all that type of stuff, the integration of full-on virtuoso drumming. You know, when people say, oh, you should play for the song, which is what Ringo does. Sometimes with Zeppelin, the song plays to Bonham and it makes the song great. And we can give you a million examples of that. For example, the opening of Rock and Roll. When the levee breaks, which sits on top of Bonham's incredible beat, which is then, you know, pumped up with Jimmy Page's incredible approach to recording his drums. But then if you think of something like Achilles' Last Stand, how over the top are Bonham's drumming? So Bonham really pulls a lot back for this band. Jimmy Page, when you look at guitarists like Scott Henderson or Steve Vai, are quoting Jimmy Page as being the guitarist that made them play the guitar. And then we have Robert Plant, who is the definition of a rock singer. So again, on this one, I think Zeppelin and the Beatles are equal. So they get a half a point each. Right, now presentation is now down to the album covers, it's down to the logos, it's down to what they look like on stage, their visual appearance, right? Again, two incredible bands here, right? Both absolutely at the peak of their game. Zeppelin's album covers have become so iconic, but so many of them have no mention, like Houses of the Holy or Led Zepp 4, have no mention of the band's name or the album's name. And they were innovative all the way through. If we think of Led Zepp 3 with that rotating, you know, disc that's inside that you can move around and shift the that's an innovative album. If you think of Led Zepp 4, the Untitled album, which looks like one cover on the front and another cover on the back, and then when you open it up you realise it's the same scene, right? No mention of the band at all. And then the use of the 4 symbols on that album to represent each member of the band. This is groundbreaking stuff. You think about the beautiful, minimal approach to Houses of the Holy. You think about physical graffiti and the way that they got that building with the windows cut out and you can arrange it to get different views, a little bit like Led Zepp 3. Think of Presence, you know, which I've got at the back here, I've got the box set here. That weird cover of this sort of all these 1950s settings with this strange, you know, object, you know, and I've held one of those objects in my hand, and that's an insane idea, that let's produce an object, a bit like 2001, some obelisk that people will have, and they're still around in the world today, being pulled out and going, this is an object, look at this is the object. Oh my God, have you got an object? Yes, I got one. I got given one by Jimmy Page back in 1977. This is bonkers stuff, but they are up against the Beatles. Now, in terms of the Beatles' style, the way they looked, the Beatles' haircut, right? We have a haircut, which is the Beatles. We have a Beatles haircut. We have the little suits. They didn't look like that in the early days. They looked like rebels in the early days. They were stood on stage in leather jackets. When Brian Epstein come in, he says, no, we went the little Italian suits. We're all going to have the same haircut. They were iconic. And then when we look at the albums, something like Sgt. Pepper is probably the greatest album cover in history, isn't it? The White Album. Before Zeppelin, they've done it. The White Album. So iconic that it was parodied in Spinal Tap as the Black Album, which of course then Metallica did for real. So the point goes here to the Beatles. You know, the Beatles had their own toys, their own imagery, they had an incredible logo. The Beatles were just so iconic. You know, they made films, and they just didn't just make films, they made great films. A Hard Day's Night is one of the greatest films of the 1960s and ushers in that sort of black and white photorealism that came from the Italian, you know, realist school of the late 40s. We see that in a Beatles film, you know, they're incredible. So the point here again goes to the Beatles. We've got another point going to the Beatles. Right, record sales, right, 2 of the biggest selling artists of all time. It's very hard to work out how many albums they've sold, and I did look up the figures, and the Super-i-ometer is the one who's looking up the figures now. And according to the Super-i-ometer, by still quite a few 100 million or whatever, the Beatles beat Led Zeppelin, right? I think the Beatles are the biggest selling artist of all time, and Zeppelin is something like the 5th biggest selling artist of all time. So that even in this area, the Beatles come and beat up Led Zeppelin. Right, let's now go to great to crap ratio. Well, did the Beatles ever put out a bad album? If you were going to say a bad album by the Beatles, what one would it be? I'm trying to think. Some of those early albums are cobbled together. We've got American versions, we've got British versions, but you come and check out some of the songs, and there's some classic songs on there. Rubber Soul's like a masterpiece, you know. Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, Let It Be, Abbey Road, The White Album, Revolver. This is just right, and they get out in 1970 without producing anything crap, in my opinion. Now, Led Zeppelin, there's a strong contingent out there which will argue that they were at their peak up until Physical Graffiti, and of course Physical Graffiti is a sort of compilation of tracks that were made in a very short amount of time. When you look at the sort of masterpiece level, when you look at Zeppelin going into the recording studio by 1969 and then recording from 69 to 71, and when we look at the material that's on Physical Graffiti that was either recorded in 1970 at the Led Zepp 3 sessions or for the Led Zepp 4 sessions, and some of these are going to 1974, but there's a window where Zeppelin are just unbelievable, and it's about a 2-year window. Some people love House of the Holy, some people don't rate it as highly. There's a lot of people that aren't fans of Presence. I'm a huge fan of Presence. There are people that aren't fans of In Through the Outdoor, and I'm not a fan of In Through the Outdoor. People think that Coda was, I think Coda's great, you know, but people thought it was an uneven album. Song Remains the Same, you know, it's like, here we have one of the greatest live bands of all time, and are they represented by that album? So we do start to see with Zeppelin that it's a fine body of work, and I would be proud of it, but up against the Beatles, no. Great to crap ratio goes to the Beatles. We've got another point going to the Beatles. And we are on to the last criteria, which is my opinion, because it's my superiometer, right? And my personal taste, of course, is probably quite obvious, is Led Zeppelin. I absolutely love Led Zeppelin. I've worshipped that band since I was 12 years old, and the Beatles have been a band that I've learned to appreciate as time goes on. So, we come to the final decision. Come on, superiometer then, do your thing. It's calculating. It's calculating. Oh, it's getting a bit wobbly. It's, oh, yes, there we go. So, this has been a bit of a real beat up by the Beatles. They've come out with 7 points, and Led Zeppelin have only come out with 3 points. This video is going to upset a lot of people, isn't it? Well, I can't help it. Don't blame me. Blame the superiometer. Blame the superiometer, right? If you don't agree with this, you are entitled to build your own superiometer if you want. It won't be as good as mine, but you can if you want. And you could see if you can get a different result. But in terms of my superiometer, the greatest band out of the Beatles and Led Zeppelin is the Beatles. If you enjoyed this video, right, and you enjoy the superiometer, because you see that really this doesn't mean anything, but what it does, it gives us a great excuse to put 2 bands alongside each other and just see what the differences are and where the similarities are and how they relate to each other and how they don't relate to each other. Please remember that that's what this video is about. It's given me an excuse to talk about 2 bands in a way that is hopefully different, because every Led Zeppelin video out there on YouTube is probably just talking about Led Zeppelin, but we've been able to get into some nooks and crannies here. That's what this is all about. So if you sat there getting really angry because Led Zeppelin didn't win, then I do have some advice for you, and it's this. Come here. Those of you getting really wound up, come here. Grow up. Right, so if you like this video, like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe. And if you want to know when the next video comes out, when the next Super-i-ometer is brought out to do the next band, and you may have some suggestions back down in the comments of, you know, some bands you'd like to for me to compare. And you never know, I might actually listen and not ignore you, and might not just do it my way. There's a few people have said that they want to see, and my suggestion on the last video of comparing Mogul Thrash to the Residents, there was one guy who wants to see that video. He may well be the only person in the world that wants to see that video, but if there's anybody who wants to see the Residents versus Mogul Thrash, then I will do that for you. But I can tell you now, the Residents will win. So that's it. So I don't even have to feed it in. See, there's certain things where it's just obvious. You know, it's just obvious in terms of sales, in terms of influence, in terms of presentation, technical ability. Mogul Thrash would probably beat the Residents on. But in terms of innovation, charisma, composition, production, influence, presentation, even sales and great to crap ratio, they're all going to win. So let's not do that one. But if you do want to know when the next video comes out, ring the notification bell, right? Now, if you really want to support me, go over to my Patreon. Now, my Patreon is developing into an incredible community of music fans and musicians. And I'm about to start work at some point on a course that will go inside my Patreon, where I can sort of create a structure for people who want to get their creative stuff out there and get people listening to it and build up some sort of momentum. I think this is what the world needs educationally at the moment, is especially for older people who have become skilled musicians and want to have their stuff out there. They don't necessarily want to sell millions of records or become famous, but they just want to be able to create a structure to get their stuff out there, but aren't so up on TikTok and Instagram, and they want to know a way of traversing that world. Well, I'm thinking about doing a course where I can explore all these things, and it would be in Patreon. But this week, my patrons got to meet online in Zoom the drum legend Bev Bevan. Bev Bevan from ELO, the guy that's played on this album down here. Let's have a look at it. You know, one of the biggest selling albums of the 70s. The guy that played drums on this. Let's see if there's a photograph of him. No, there isn't. There's just that inside, you see. That's how they used to make albums in the 70s. That's what they used to do to sell records. Some bloke stealing a tiny UFO with the word ELO on it. Raising his fist in the air as he's chased by sort of what looks like sort of Turkish warriors with their swords are out in the desert. Very good. But there he is, Bev Bevan, drums, rotor toms and percussion. You know, it's like, if you get to play rotor toms on an album and then you get a credit for doing so, you are a legend. And Bev is a legend. And he actually came into my Patreon the other day and sat and chatted with my patrons. Now, it didn't go down that well because he couldn't really hear what anyone was saying because we had technical issues. But my patrons did meet him. And I'm going to do that again. So there's stuff going on my Patreon which is amazing. And if you really want to go and check it out. Now, you can go and check on the link. It won't just grab your money off you straight away. You can have a look around and see what's there. And if it looks interesting, then please become a patron. So I've come to the end of the video. I hope you like this comparison between Led Zeppelin and which was it, the Beatles, and I hope you're not too upset that the Beatles won. And I suppose there's going to be people out there cheering at the moment. You know, they're running around pulling their shirt over their head and, you know, doing that as they run around because the Beatles won, you know. And I think that's why it's good to, because the Beatles, the Beatles Led Zeppelin thing is basically that mod rocker thing, isn't it? It's always been there. It's always been there. That's worthy of a video, I think, is to get into that mod rocker thing. I was a rocker, which meant I didn't really listen to The Who because they were like a mod band. And when I did listen to The Who, I thought, well, they sound like a real rock band to me, like Led Zeppelin. I didn't understand it at all. And things like bands like Madness and The Specials, I love those bands. But there's always been that thing of those people with their top buttoned up and their hair cut a little bit like this, walking around being that like the Paul Weller cool. And then there's people that are cool because they look like Robert Plant, right? So, and I think that's an interesting thing to get into. Anyway, I'm done now. I'm wittering on, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.